Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corner, we've talked about a lot of interesting topics related to hardware, at least those that are interesting for those who really enjoy picking apart and really making the most out of today's hardware. We talked about USB charging and the USB form factor, USB Type A, the Type B printer cables, USB Type C, but we haven't talked yet about the actual USB standard, because it's one thing to ask about the power capabilities of it, and another to ask whether it's going to remain the ubiquitous actual interface or standard for connecting wired devices to computers. And the first question that I had, and this one I'm going to actually answer myself directly on the podcast, is when the USB form factor changes from USB-A to USB-C as we're seeing coming in, even within the same form factor, can the USB standard continue to evolve? And the answer is yes. Even when, for most of the evolution of USB, we've had consistency for periods where USB to micro USB, let's say, has been the norm for mobile, USB A to USB A for desktop stuff, and now USB A to C and C to C. Even when that remains the normative connection, and each one kind of displaces the other, the actual USB standard that governs the data interconnect has its own separate existence from the actual cables and continues to evolve. So my next question, and again to spoil the episode slightly, I will give you a chance to answer some of these, is how many devices can you connect to USB bus, and where are we now? So it was talking about USB 4, and the answer is apparently 127 devices is a host controller limit. That, in other words, one USB port, and this is actually kind of a crazy thing to think about, is I often think, why do desktop computers, I'm looking at the one I just built, the motherboard, why don't they just give you like 20 or 30 ports, like way more than you might need? They don't take up that much space. Throw in 15 USB-As, 15 Type-Cs, and you'll give people as many ports as they can possibly want to stick things into their computer and not have to bother with all these adapters and USB hubs. And the answer, I'm guessing in part, is due to the fact that one port can actually probably do it all if it had push. Now we'd have to talk about power requirements as well, but it would be good in the context of our chat here to talk about this concept of USB hubs and how this actually works. So if the bus, the data connection, can address up to 127 end devices, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you were to connect 100 USB mice to that device, that it would work necessarily, because you've got the power aspect too. But if you have those powered USB hubs that solve that issue, could you really drive 100 mice off one USB hub in a modern computer? And the second question, Herman and Corin, for those who do buy these gizmos, I think I'm probably like many people. If I look back at my purchase history on AliExpress and the attempts to set up a nice workstation, the pattern that I unfortunately keep falling into is I'll say, okay, I need a 16 USB hub for my desk. How many USB devices could I possibly need to charge or connect? And then in 6 months, you fill that up and you buy another one, or you daisy chain another one. And now instead of having just one really beefy one, you end up with this kind of sprawling mess of interconnected ones, which is partially why one of my new foundational things in hardware is to look for industrial devices. Because this is my secret keyword, if you put the word industrial into a search on AliExpress or some platform and you search for industrial USB hub, you'll get to that really beefy stuff that if you want something with 100 physical ports, they'll make it and you're done for the time being. And I think it probably would have actually saved me quite a bit of money. And it's just frustrating when we talk about e-waste to buy all these little small things and then they become deprecated, and you kind of wish you just had the forethought to buy one really generous and well-made hub instead of all these little things. So Herman and Corin has talked today about the evolution of the USB standard itself and that little thing that governs the data links between our computers and wired devices. And let's talk about how data can actually be broken up in terms of USB hubs. What should one be doing? Should one be always avoiding the daisy chaining? And when do you know that you need a powered hub versus one that just draws from the bus power? Is there a way to know a certain number of devices or a cumulative draw? Or are there certain devices that, let's take the example of a USB webcam, it's always better to use a direct connection to the port to ensure the reliable transmission of video. I think that's actually quite an important one for those who spend a lot of time doing Zoom calls. Herman and Corin, let's talk everything related to USB transmission, data and power in today's episode of My Word Prompts.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here in our usual spot in Jerusalem with my brother, looking at a literal mountain of cables on the floor. It is a rainy afternoon outside, but inside, it is a jungle of copper and plastic.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I feel personally attacked by that observation, Corn. Those cables are organized by a system only I understand. It is a chronological and functional archive of the last 2 decades of peripheral connectivity.
It looks like a Technicolor bird nest, Herman. I am pretty sure I see a Firewire 400 cable peeking out from the bottom, which tells you everything you need to know about how long it has been since you cleaned this place. But it is actually quite fitting because Daniel's prompt today is about the hidden world of USB hubs and the standards that govern them. It is one of those things we use every single day without really thinking about the complexity happening under the hood. We just plug things in and expect them to work, but as we have all experienced, they often do not.
It is a great prompt because USB is the ultimate example of a technology that has become a victim of its own success. Most people think of USB as just a plug, a simple physical interface, but it is really a massive, incredibly complex communication protocol that has to handle everything from a tiny mouse click to a high-resolution video stream, often over the same wire at the same time. And it has to do it while being backwards compatible with devices made in the late 90s. That is a monumental engineering challenge.
Right, and Daniel pointed out something important in his prompt. Even as the physical shapes change, like going from the old rectangular Type A to the oval Type C, the actual USB standard is evolving on a separate track. You can have a Type C connector that is actually just running USB 2.0 speeds, which is something that trips people up all the time. I bought a cheap charging cable last week that looked modern, but when I tried to transfer photos, it was like watching paint dry.
Oh, it is a total nightmare for consumers. You see that beautiful new Type-C port and you think you are getting the latest and greatest, but sometimes it is just the old plumbing behind a new facade. The USB Implementers Forum, or the USB-IF, has not exactly made it easy with their naming conventions. We went from USB 3.0 to 3.1 Gen 1, then to 3.2 Gen 2 by 2. It sounds like a math equation gone wrong. And now, in early 26, we are dealing with USB 4 and even USB 4 version 2.0, which can hit 80 or even 120 gigabits per second. But if you use the wrong hub, you are throttled back to the Stone Age.
We should probably start with the basics of how a hub actually works. When I plug a hub into my laptop, what is the laptop seeing? Is it just seeing one big device that acts as a gateway? Or does it actually know there are 5 or 6 different things plugged into that hub?
That is where the magic and the frustration begins. Your computer sees the hub itself as a distinct device. In the USB world, there is a concept called the tiered star topology. Think of your computer as the center of the star, or the root. That root has a host controller, which is the brain. When you plug in a hub, you are adding a new branch to that star. The host controller communicates with the hub, and then the hub acts as a sort of traffic cop for everything plugged into it. It is not just a physical extension, it is a logical expansion of the network.
So the hub is not just a dumb physical splitter like a power strip. I think that is the biggest misconception. People think it is just copper wires branching out.
Not at all. A power strip just connects wires in parallel. A USB hub has a silicon chip inside called a hub controller. It has to manage the timing of data packets. USB is a polled bus, meaning the host controller asks each device, "Hey, do you have any data for me?" The hub has to make sure those requests get to the right peripheral and that the responses do not crash into each other. If you have a USB 2.0 hub, it is also doing something called a split transaction to handle slower devices without slowing down the whole bus. It is a lot of heavy lifting for a little plastic dongle.
That brings up the famous 127 device limit. Daniel mentioned this, and it sounds like a massive number. I do not think I have ever seen anyone with 127 things plugged into a single computer. Even you, with your cable mountain, probably do not have that many active devices. Where does that number even come from?
It comes down to the way USB addresses devices. In the original specification, they used a 7-bit field for the device address. If you remember your binary math, 2 to the power of 7 is 128. But address 0 is reserved for a special state when a device is first plugged in and has not been assigned a permanent address yet. So that leaves you with 127 usable addresses. It seemed like an infinite number in 1996, but today we are hitting it more often than you would think.
Okay, but here's the catch. If I buy a 7-port hub, how many addresses am I using up? Is it just one for the hub, or is it more?
You are using 8, one for the hub itself and one for each of the 7 ports. This is why people sometimes hit the limit sooner than they expect if they are daisy chaining multiple hubs. Every single hub in the chain takes an address, and it is not just physical ports. Some complex devices, like a high-end gaming keyboard with a built-in OLED screen, a volume knob, and a USB pass-through, might actually show up as 3 or 4 separate devices to the host controller. A modern docking station can easily eat up 15 to 20 addresses all by itself because it has internal hubs, an Ethernet controller, an audio codec, and card readers.
So if you have a monitor with a built-in USB hub, and you plug a keyboard into that, and that keyboard has a USB pass-through port, you're already 4 or 5 devices deep into your limit without even trying. It is like a Russian nesting doll of hardware.
Exactly. And while 127 sounds like plenty, there are other limits that hit you way before you reach that number. The most common one is endpoints. This is the one that really gets people. Each USB device can have multiple endpoints, which are like individual communication channels or pipes. For example, a composite device like a gaming headset might have one endpoint for the audio out, another for the microphone in, and another for the RGB lighting control. Host controllers, especially the ones built into modern Intel or AMD chipsets, often have a limit on the total number of endpoints they can track. That limit is often 64 or 96, which is much lower than the theoretical 127 device limit.
That explains why sometimes you plug in a device and the computer says, "Not enough resources," even if you only have 10 things plugged in. I always thought that was a software bug in Windows, but you are saying it is a hard physical limit in the silicon?
Precisely. It is usually an XHCI endpoint limitation in the hardware of the USB controller on your motherboard. When you plug in a high-end VR headset or a complex streaming deck, they can consume dozens of endpoints. Once the controller runs out of slots in its internal memory to track those pipes, it just gives up. It does not matter if you have open physical ports, the brain is full.
Let's talk about power, because that is where I usually run into trouble. Daniel asked about when you need a powered hub versus a bus-powered one. I have definitely had situations where I plug a portable hard drive into a small hub, and the drive just makes a clicking sound and never mounts. It sounds like it is dying, but then I plug it directly into the laptop and it works fine.
That clicking is the sound of a hard drive desperately trying to spin up, but not having enough torque to get the motor going. It is a classic power issue. A standard USB 2.0 port is only required to provide 500 milliamps of current at 5 volts. USB 3.0 bumped that up to 900 milliamps. If you have a bus-powered hub, it is taking that 900 milliamps from the computer and trying to share it among all the devices you plug in.
Plus the hub itself needs a little bit of that power to run its own internal controller chip.
Right. So if you plug in 2 portable hard drives that each want 800 milliamps to spin up, you are asking for 1600 milliamps from a port that only gives 900. The math just does not work. The voltage drops, the drive clicks, and you risk corrupting your data. That is when you absolutely need a self-powered hub, which is what we usually call a powered hub. It has its own wall wart that plugs into an outlet and provides a dedicated power pool for the ports.
Is there a rule of thumb for this? Like, if it has a motor, it needs a powered hub? Or is it more complicated now with things like USB power delivery?
That is a good starting point. Anything with a spinning disk, or something that charges a battery like a phone, or high-intensity LED lights, those should go on a powered hub. Simple things like mice, keyboards, and thumb drives use very little power, so they are usually fine on a bus-powered hub. But honestly, if you are setting up a permanent desk, just get a powered hub. It saves so much headache. And with USB power delivery, or PD, things have changed. A modern PD hub can pass through up to 100 or even 240 watts of power to charge your laptop while also powering your peripherals. But you have to make sure the power brick connected to the hub is beefy enough to handle the total load.
What about the data side of things? Daniel mentioned daisy chaining hubs. I have seen some crazy setups in server rooms or even home offices where people have a hub plugged into a hub, plugged into a hub. Is there a physical limit to how many layers deep you can go before the signal just gives up?
Yes, there is a very strict limit. The spec calls it the tiered star topology, and it allows for a maximum of 7 tiers. But remember, your host controller inside the laptop is tier 1. The internal wiring from the motherboard to the actual port on the case might even be considered tier 2 in some designs, so you usually only have 5 or so tiers left for external devices. If you go deeper than that, the timing of the signal starts to break down.
Timing seems to be the hidden boss of USB. It is not just about the bits, it is about when they arrive.
It really is. USB signals travel at a significant fraction of the speed of light, but they still take time to propagate through the copper wires and the silicon chips in the hubs. Each hub adds a tiny bit of latency, maybe a few dozen nanoseconds. But more importantly, the USB protocol has strict timeout windows. If the host controller sends a request and the response does not come back within a few microseconds because it had to travel through 6 different hubs, the host controller thinks the device has disconnected or failed. This is why you should generally avoid daisy chaining if you can. It is always better to have one big 10-port hub connected directly to the computer than 3-4 port hubs chained together.
That leads perfectly into Daniel's question about why motherboards do not just have 30 ports on the back. If one controller can handle 127 devices, why do I only get 6 or 8 ports on a high-end motherboard? It seems like a waste of potential.
This is a great question that gets into the economics and physical design of computers. First, there is physical space. The back I/O panel of a computer is a very crowded piece of real estate. You have to fit audio jacks, Ethernet, video outputs, and USB ports. But the real bottleneck is internal. Each USB controller on the motherboard needs a connection to the CPU, usually through the PCI Express lanes or the chipset.
And those lanes are like the highway lanes of the computer. They are limited.
Exactly. Your CPU only has a certain number of PCI Express lanes. Most of them go to your graphics card and your NVMe storage drives. The motherboard manufacturers have to decide how to allocate the remaining lanes. If they wanted to give you 20 full-speed USB 3.2 Gen 2x2 ports, they would have to sacrifice bandwidth for your SSD or your GPU. It is a zero-sum game.
So instead, they give you a few high-speed ports that are directly wired, and then maybe use an internal hub chip to turn one controller into 4 slower ports for things like your mouse and keyboard.
That is exactly what they do. If you look at your motherboard manual, you will often see that some ports share bandwidth. If you plug a fast external SSD into port A, port B might slow down because they are both hanging off the same internal hub chip. Also, maintaining signal integrity at 10 or 20 gigabits per second over long traces on a motherboard is expensive. You need components called redrivers and retimers to keep the signal clean. Adding those for 30 ports would make a motherboard cost $1,000.
I want to talk about webcams and audio interfaces, because Daniel mentioned that some devices seem to require a direct connection. I've experienced this myself. If I put my webcam on a cheap hub, the video sometimes stutters or the resolution drops. Why is that? Is it just bandwidth, or is there something else going on?
Bandwidth is part of it, but the bigger issue is a specific type of USB data transfer called isochronous transfer. USB has 4 different ways of moving data: control, interrupt, bulk, and isochronous. For things like a file transfer to a thumb drive, it uses bulk transfer. If a packet gets lost or delayed, the system just asks for it again. It does not matter if it takes an extra millisecond. But for audio and video, you need a steady, guaranteed stream of data. You cannot wait for a retransmission because the next frame of video is already arriving.
So if the hub is busy talking to my mouse or my keyboard, the webcam might miss its window to send data.
Sort of. In a hub, especially older or cheaper ones, there is a component called a transaction translator, or TT. If you have a mix of old USB 2.0 devices and new USB 3.0 devices, the hub has to translate between those different speeds. Many cheap hubs have a single transaction translator for all the ports. If your mouse is sending a bunch of slow data, it can actually clog up the translator and cause your high-speed webcam to drop frames because the hub is too busy translating the slow stuff.
That is fascinating. So it is not just the total speed of the pipe, it is the actual processing power inside the hub being overwhelmed by the different types of traffic. It is like a translator at the UN trying to handle 5 different languages at once and falling behind.
Exactly. This is why high-end hubs will often advertise having multiple transaction translators, or MTT. An MTT hub has a dedicated translator for every single port, which means a slow device on port 1 won't affect a fast device on port 2. If you are a streamer or someone doing professional audio, you want to look for that MTT label. But even then, for something as sensitive as a professional audio interface or a 4K webcam, a direct connection to the motherboard is always the safest bet. It eliminates that extra layer of processing and potential timing issues. Audio interfaces are especially picky because they require extremely low latency for monitoring.
Daniel mentioned a secret he has, which is searching for industrial USB hubs on sites like AliExpress or specialized electronics vendors. I looked into this after reading his prompt, and it is a real rabbit hole. These things look like they belong in a factory or a tank, not on a desk. They are usually made of heavy metal and have these weird screw-down connectors.
Oh, industrial hubs are the real deal. I actually use one for my main workstation. They are usually made of heavy-duty steel or aluminum. They have mounting brackets so you can screw them to the underside of a desk or a rack, and they often have much better power circuitry. While a consumer hub might use the cheapest possible capacitors to hit a $10 price point, an industrial hub is designed to run 24/7 in a dusty, hot environment without failing.
And they often have those high-end features you mentioned, like multiple transaction translators and dedicated power for every single port.
Right. They also often have something called per port overcurrent protection and ESD protection, which stands for electrostatic discharge. In a cheap hub, if one device shorts out or you get a static shock when you plug something in, it might kill the whole hub or even send a surge back to your computer's motherboard. An industrial hub is built with isolation transformers and fast-acting fuses to isolate that fault so only that one port shuts down. It is much more robust. Some of them even have galvanic isolation, which is great for audio because it prevents ground loops and hum.
It is funny because Daniel mentioned how he kept buying these small cheap hubs and then having to replace them as his needs grew. It is that classic problem of e-waste where we buy the $5 solution 3 times instead of the $50 solution once. I am looking at my drawer of dead dongles right now and feeling very guilty.
It is so true. I have a drawer full of those little plastic 4-port hubs that I cannot bring myself to throw away, but I also never use because they are so unreliable. They overheat, they drop connections, or the ports just get loose over time. If you know you are going to have a lot of devices, jumping straight to a high-quality, powered, industrial-style hub from a brand like StarTech or CoolGear is actually a huge money saver in the long run. Plus, it just makes your desk look much cooler, like you are running a command center.
I love that idea. So, if we are looking at practical takeaways for someone listening who is struggling with their USB setup, what is the hierarchy of where you should plug things in? Give us the definitive Poppleberry guide.
Okay, here is the Herman Poppleberry tier list for USB connections. Tier 1, the direct motherboard ports on the back of the PC. These are for your most critical, high bandwidth, or low latency devices. That means your primary external SSD, your professional audio interface, your VR headset, and your high-res webcam. These get the shortest path to the CPU.
Got it. Direct for the heavy hitters. What about the ports on the top or front of the case?
Those are actually Tier 1.5. They are usually connected to the motherboard via a long internal cable, which can sometimes cause signal degradation for very fast drives. They are fine for most things, but if you are having issues with a fast drive, move it to the back. Now, Tier 2 is a high-quality powered hub connected to a high-speed port on your computer. This is where you put your secondary drives, your printer, your desktop microphone, and maybe a secondary camera. These are things that need power and decent speed, but are not as sensitive to tiny timing fluctuations.
And Tier 3? The bottom of the barrel?
Tier 3 is the bus-powered hub or the pass-through ports on your monitor or keyboard. These are for what I call the low-bandwidth peripherals. Your mouse, your keyboard, your graphics tablet, a basic thumb drive for moving small files. These things use very little data and very little power, so they can handle being at the end of a longer chain. Just do not try to run a webcam off your keyboard's USB port. It will almost certainly end in tears.
That makes a lot of sense. What about charging? I see a lot of people using their USB hubs as a charging station for their phones, tablets, and headphones. Is that a good idea, or are they just asking for a fire?
It depends entirely on the hub. If it is a self-powered hub with a beefy power supply, it is generally fine. But many hubs are not designed for high current charging. They might provide the standard 500 milliamps, which will charge a modern smartphone at a snail's pace. If you want to charge things quickly, you really need a hub that explicitly supports the USB power delivery standard, or at least the older battery charging 1.2 spec. Those can negotiate higher voltages and currents to charge a laptop or a fast-charging phone. If the hub gets hot to the touch while charging, that is a bad sign. It means the internal voltage regulators are being pushed beyond their limit.
It is crazy how much the power delivery standard has changed things. I can now run a whole docking station, 2 monitors, and charge my laptop all through a single USB Type-C cable. It feels like magic compared to the old days of having a separate power brick for everything.
It is a marvel of engineering, honestly. But it also adds another layer of complexity. That one cable is carrying high-speed data, video signals through something called DisplayPort Alt Mode, and up to 100 or even 240 watts of power. If that cable is low quality, or if it is too long, the whole system can become unstable. This is why you see those very short, thick cables that come with high-end docks. They are built with e-marker chips inside that tell the computer exactly what the cable is capable of. If you swap that for a cheap, long cable you found at a gas station, your monitors might flicker or your laptop might stop charging.
I think one of the most confusing things for people is when they see a USB Type-C port and they do not know if it supports video or charging. It seems like the industry has moved toward a universal plug, but made the actual capabilities more mysterious than ever. It is like having a universal key that only opens some doors, but you do not know which ones until you try them.
You are absolutely right. The physical connector is unified, but the feature set is fragmented. You have to look for those tiny little icons next to the port, and even then, they are hard to see. If you see a lightning bolt, it is probably Thunderbolt 3, 4, or 5. If you see a little D-shaped icon, it supports DisplayPort video. If you see a battery icon, it supports high-power charging. But on many laptops, especially cheaper ones, there are no icons at all. You have to dig through the spec sheet on the manufacturer's website just to find out what your ports can actually do. It is a failure of user experience design.
It feels like we are in this awkward middle ground where the technology is incredibly capable, but the user experience is still catching up. We want it to be plug and play, but it is often plug and pray. I have spent many hours rebooting my computer just to get a dock to recognize a second monitor.
That is a great way to put it. And that is why Daniel's point about the underlying standard evolving independently of the form factor is so crucial. We are moving toward USB 4 version 2.0 now, which promises even higher speeds and better resource management. It uses a system called data tunneling, where it can dynamically allocate every single bit of bandwidth to whatever needs it most in real time. In older versions of USB, if you had a video stream taking up a chunk of bandwidth, that bandwidth was reserved even if the video was not using all of it. USB 4 is much more efficient.
So, it is like moving from a system of dedicated lanes on a highway to a system where the lanes can change width, depending on how many cars are in each one. That should make hubs much more reliable, because the hub won't just hit a hard limit on one port while another port is sitting idle.
That is a perfect analogy. It should also help with the endpoint issue I mentioned earlier, as newer controllers are getting better at managing those resources. But we are still years away from that being the standard in every budget laptop. For now, we have to be smart about how we manage our connections.
I am curious about your thoughts on the future of physical ports. Do you think we will eventually get to a point where we do not need hubs because everything is wireless? Or is the reliability of a wired connection always going to be superior? I mean, we have Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 6 now, which are incredibly fast.
I think for high performance tasks, wires are here to stay for a long time. Wireless is great for convenience, but it is prone to interference and it has much higher latency. If you are a gamer or a video editor working with 8K footage or a musician recording multiple tracks, you want that direct physical connection. However, I do think we will see more integration. Imagine a desk where the entire surface is a wireless power and data transmitter using something like ultra wideband. You just set your keyboard or your phone down anywhere and it connects. We are seeing early versions of that, but for now, the humble USB hub is still the unsung hero of the modern workspace. It is the glue that holds our digital lives together.
It really is. I am looking at my desk now, and between my monitors, my mouse, my keyboard, my audio interface, and my external backup drive, I am using 6 ports. Without a hub, I would be constantly swapping cables and wearing out the ports on my expensive laptop.
And that is the dream of USB, right? Universal Serial Bus. One way to connect everything. We have mostly achieved the universal part, now we are just refining the execution. It is a journey that started with a slow, clunky connector in 1996 and has led us to a world where a single cable can do everything.
Before we wrap up, I want to go back to Daniel's tip about industrial hubs. If someone wants to find one, what keywords should they be looking for other than just industrial? Because I searched for that and got a lot of results for heavy machinery.
Look for metal housing, DIN rail mounting, wide temperature range, and especially MTT or multiple transaction translator. Also, look for hubs that have a screw-down power connector or a terminal block. Those cheap barrel jacks can fall out easily if you move your desk, but industrial hubs often have a locking connector so the power stays put even if you tug on the cable. Another good keyword is high ESD protection, usually rated in kilovolts. If it says it can handle 15 kilovolts of air discharge, you know it is built like a tank.
That is such a pro tip. I might actually replace my plastic hub with one of those. It sounds like it would solve a lot of my intermittent connection issues, especially during the dry winter months when static is everywhere.
It probably would, and it gives you a great excuse to do some cable management corn. You could mount it under your desk and hide all those wires.
Hey, leave my cable nest alone. It has character. It is a historical record of my technological journey.
It has dust bunnies and a potential fire hazard. That is what it has.
Fair enough. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. I think the big takeaway for me is that a USB hub is a lot smarter than I gave it credit for, but that intelligence has limits that we need to respect if we want our gear to work reliably. It is not just a splitter, it is a network switch for your peripherals.
Exactly. Respect the power limits, avoid long chains, understand your endpoints, and when in doubt, plug your most important stuff directly into the motherboard. If you follow those rules, your USB experience will be much smoother.
Great advice. And hey, if you've been enjoying my weird prompts, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It genuinely helps other people find the show, and we love reading your feedback. We have been doing this for a long time, and your support is what keeps the lights on and the cables tangled.
It really does make a difference. We have been doing this for over 700 episodes now, and it is the listeners that keep us curious. Every prompt we get, like this one from Daniel, teaches us something new.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for all our past episodes and our RSS feed. If you want to get in touch or send us a prompt like Daniel did, you can use the contact form on the site or email us at show@myweirdprompts.com. We read every single one, even the ones about cables.
We are also on all the major podcast platforms, so whatever you use to listen, we are probably there. Just search for My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for joining us today in Jerusalem. It has been a blast, despite Herman's constant judging of my office space.
Until next time, keep your connections solid, your drivers updated, and your transaction translators multiple.
Thanks for listening to my weird prompts. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.